Hello there everyone. So in this video I'll be counting down my top 10 Dreamcast games. Now before we start I have a few points to address. Firstly, this list is completely 100% my opinion. It is entirely subjective and your opinions will probably differ from mine. Second off, this list doesn't take into consideration the price or rarity of certain games, just the overall quality of the games chosen, because otherwise we'd have to disqualify a few certain games that we'll get to later on down the list. Third off, I don't own every game on this list, but every game that is featured on this list I have played at least once. And also, lastly, there will be minor spoilers for certain titles as we go through the list, as it's necessary to describe the game and recommend it. Although I'm going to try and keep the spoilers to a minimum, because I don't want to spoil some of the stories for some of these games, because they're pretty good. But, without further ado, let's get into the video. So, for number 10, I've chosen Power Stone 2. Power Stone 2 is a 3D fighter developed by Capcom, who are most famous for making the Street Fighter series. The original Power Stone was a launch title for the system, but the sequel is far more loved by most people. It did what every good sequel does, improving upon the original in almost every way. It added new characters, new maps, and it added 4-player multiplayer battles, which the original lacked. While there's definitely no lack of fighting games for the Dreamcast, Power Stone 2 is considered one of the best ones, especially one of the best 3D fighters, because around about that time they were far less common. And I guess 2D fighters are still much more common than 3D fighters, but, you know, you didn't get many 3D fighters. This was like their infancy, and Power Stone 2 is a brilliant example of a great 3D fighter. For number 9, I have chosen Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is another fighting game, but this one is a more traditional 2D fighter as opposed to Power Stone 2's 3D fighting formula. The series lives on to this day, but many fans still claim that the series peaked with this entry. Along with that, the game is almost universally considered to be one of the best 2D fighters ever released. The amount of unique special moves and combo potential, along with a huge character roster from both Marvel and Capcom, combined with the brilliant visuals, makes this game phenomenal and a must-have for the Dreamcast. Number 8 is a game I actually do own, Choo Choo Rocket. Now, Choo Choo Rocket at its core is a simple puzzle game featuring cats and mice. Your goal is to guide all the mice to a rocket to allow them to escape from the cats. The game offered a lot of content, including single-player missions, the ability to create your own puzzles, and the thing that this game is most loved for, the multiplayer. Multiplayer in this game is utter mayhem, as not only are you fighting against your friends to save the most mice, but you can also send cats towards the other players to stop them in their tracks. The game offers tons of fun and is really easy to jump into. It's also pretty common, especially in Europe, where it was a pack-in title for the Dreamcast briefly. Unlike most puzzle games of the time, or even now to be honest, Choo Choo Rocket is a unique title and has a lot of replay value, especially when you take the multiplayer into consideration. For number 7, I've chosen Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio if you're in North America. Jet Set Radio is a very unique release. It was pretty much the first game to use cel-shaded graphics. This is a art style in games that was much more common in the early 2000s. It's still seen in the modern era, but not as much as it was in the early 2000s. And Jet Set Radio really started that whole trend, and it's definitely visually stunning, especially for the time. The premise of this game is basically you play as a spray can wielding skater with the task of exploring a futuristic city which is named Tokyo To. I'm guessing it's based off Tokyo. You basically go around spraying graffiti all over the place while rebelling against the police and strengthening your gang, which is called the GGs. The game gave players a lot to do in the world outside of the main story, such as performing stunts and creating your own graffiti to use in the game. This game is one of the lesser known titles for the Dreamcast. Like, one of the lesser known popular games. Like, there's lesser known games that aren't as popular. But Jet Set Radio is one of the popular titles that's less known and less spoken about to this day. But it's definitely worth picking up and playing today. For number 6, I have chose Skies of Arcadia. Skies of Arcadia is a turn-based RPG, similar to the Final Fantasy series. The story revolves around a rogue air pirate by the name of Vyse. I think that's how you pronounce it, V-Y-S-E. I think it's pronounced Vyse, but you know. So it revolves around Vise and his friends traveling a massive world, well, for the time, and discovering plenty of secrets along the way. Combining this with the incredible ship versus ship battles and the minigame that could be installed onto the VMU, and you had an amazing adventure that you simply couldn't put down. In the genre of turn-based RPGs, it's hard not to be called a simple, inferior Final Fantasy clone, especially when this was around about the time of Final Fantasy VII, which is still not only the most highly acclaimed Final Fantasy game, but one of the most highly acclaimed games of all time. But Skies of Arcadia still manages to be considered unique to the Final Fantasy series, and a lot of people consider it better than the Final Fantasy series. Now, I mean, it's a great game. I'm not sure if I'd go that far. I've not played every single Final Fantasy game, so I don't really have a concrete opinion, but Skies of Arcadia is definitely a brilliant RPG for the Dreamcast. A must-own if you can find it. It is, unfortunately, pretty rare these days. But anyway, moving on to number 5, where I've chosen Crazy Taxi 2. Now, Crazy Taxi 2 is a sequel to the incredibly popular arcade title Crazy Taxi. Really? I didn't know that. We'll see that in a little bit. Crazy Taxi will be making an appearance later on. But out of all the games on this list, Crazy Taxi 2 is the one I have the least experience with. The game is pretty similar to the first one, but that's not a bad thing, because Crazy Taxi is a hell of a lot of fun, and so is Crazy Taxi 2. It's a great game, and it's so much fun, but I just consider it not as good as the original. Like, I mean, there are some cases where I think sequels improve upon games, like Power Stone 2 over Power Stone 1, but I think Crazy Taxi 1 is a better experience than Crazy Taxi 2, but both are phenomenal games. But anyway, number 4, we have Shenmue 2. The second chapter in the epic saga from Sega, Shenmue 2 was one of the last Sega-made games for the Dreamcast. Now, if you live in North America, you won't be able to play this game on the Dreamcast, as it wasn't released for the Dreamcast in that region. Instead, you'll have to get the Xbox version, or the remastered version for PS4 and Xbox One. I don't really want to talk too much about this game because I don't want to spoil the story. Because it's a huge, massive story that you really have to play to experience. But, briefly, it takes place directly after the first game, and it sees the main character named Ryo in China on a quest for revenge against the man who killed his father. That's a basic plot summary. I mean, I don't want to go much further than that because that will get into spoiler territory, and like I said, you really should experience this game for yourself because it's definitely a brilliant game. So anyway, Shenmue 2 is fantastic, but it can be expensive to find complete. It's a 4-disc set, right? You got 3 game discs and a bonus disc, I believe. So finding all 4 discs in perfect condition is pretty difficult, plus the outer cardboard sleeve, and especially if you're in Europe with these horribly flimsy cases, finding the thing perfect is very, very challenging. But if you can, pick it up. You will not regret it. Shenmue 2 is a phenomenal game. But for number 3, I chose Shenmue 1. Now we have the original. I prefer Shenmue 1 over the second, as I simply prefer the characters and the story of the original compared to the sequel, as well as the setting, which is in Yokosuka in Japan. I prefer the setting of Shenmue 1 over Shenmue 2, but both are phenomenal games, and you should definitely play both of them because they are a series and they are one whole story. It's not like a sequel where it's like they're not connected at all. They are both direct follow-ups to each other. But in this first game in the series, we see everything get set into motion as we see the main character, again Ryo Hazuki, trying as hard as he can to find answers about the man who killed his father. The game was one of the very first open-world life simulator type of games that led to the creation of games like Elder Scrolls and The Witcher. Although Elder Scrolls did exist before Shenmue, but it was completely different. It wasn't a massive open-world fantasy game like it is now. But without Shenmue, those types of games, I'm not going to say they wouldn't have existed, because they probably would have, but they would definitely be a lot different. And Shenmue is brilliant. Shenmue 2 is brilliant as well, but Shenmue 1, if you're going to play either of them, well, obviously you need to play the first one first, otherwise you wouldn't get the story, but you know, Shenmue 1, if you're going to play one of them, definitely play the first one. if you can appreciate it, you will love it. Because in saying that, it isn't the easiest game in the world to get into right away. But if you stick with it, if you can get into it, you should really keep playing it, because it really is an unforgettable experience that is still incredibly impressive nearly 20 years later. Now, for number 2, I've chosen another game I actually have here, Crazy Taxi, although I own Shenmue 1 and 2, the remaster. I just forgot to bring it. But anyway, Crazy Taxi is number 2. This is a port of the smash hit arcade title of the same name, like I mentioned earlier. This game is the pure definition of chaos. In this game, you drive at breakneck speeds in an attempt to make as much cash as possible in a limited amount of time, while also performing tricks and other stunts to impress customers and increase your overall take from the shift. This game is just so much fun, and it's really easy to play, really easy to get into, really accessible to all audiences. It's just a really fun game. Like, I mean, it's not that deep. It's not like there's a huge story or anything. It's just a fun game. And it's pretty cheap now. Definitely, like, much cheaper than the sequel. It's one of the cheaper Dreamcast games because it's one of the more common ones. And the Dreamcast version is probably the best version of it. I mean, there's other versions on the GameCube and the PS2, but they're ports of the port. So, I mean, outside of owning the arcade cabinet, the Dreamcast version is probably the best version. But game, it's so fun, really easy to play, and it's definitely a must-have for any Dreamcast owner. Now, before we get to number 1, I'm just going to give a quick few honourable mentions. I'm going to give these to Power Stone 1, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Soul Calibur, and Ikaruga. These are all great games, and probably a lot of you would rank these higher than some of the games I have put on this list. But I didn't include them on the list because 1, I don't own them, and 2, I've never played them. So I don't want to include games based on what other people have said because my opinion may differ. So those are the 4 honourable mentions I'm going to talk about just now, but there is one other game that needs discussion because it's been lacking this whole list, and any fans of the Dreamcast have probably noticed it's missing. So quickly before number 1, we need to address Sonic Adventure 2. Now, of course, this game is great, and it definitely deserves to be on the list. So why isn't it? Well, apparently, there's a terrible issue with the Dreamcast port of the game, in which nearly a third of all the copies produced have a programming error in them, which makes the game unbeatable, due to an unavoidable game-breaking glitch in the final level. So, for that reason, I cannot recommend buying the Dreamcast version of this game, unless you're buying it as a collector's item. If you're buying the game to play, don't get the Dreamcast version. Instead, I would recommend that you pick up the GameCube version, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. It's the same game, but it's on the GameCube. It's the exact same game. You get more multiplayer content, I think, but the exact same game, and it doesn't have that game-breaking glitch in it. Now, if this glitch wasn't present in the Dreamcast version, I would have put Sonic Adventure 2 as the number 2 choice. But that potential issue cannot be overlooked, especially when you would have such a high chance of getting a copy with the glitch present. I mean, nearly a third of all the copies produced. That's nearly, probably around about 30%, because it's not quite a third of all the copies. So you've got around about a 30% chance of getting the glitch. And then to get to the final level and then not be able to play it because of the glitch would be a bit unfair. So I can't recommend the Dreamcast version. Get the GameCube version, or get the version that was released on the PlayStation Store or Xbox Live Arcade for the 360 if you're going to play Adventure 2. But anyway, on to number 1 now, which may now be pretty obvious. Number 1 is Sonic Adventure 1. The first Dreamcast game that I ever saw and that I ever played. Sonic Adventure is still an absolutely phenomenal game that is incredibly fun to play through to this day. Now, many of you probably think that Sonic is just for kids and that the games from the franchise are just a big joke. But this game was from a different time. This was from a time where Sonic was still considered cool, I swear. I'm determined to make that joke in almost every video I make. But anyway, back then, liking Sonic games was perfectly acceptable for people of all ages. There's so much to like about this game. From all the interlocking storylines that combine into one huge epic story, the amazingly varied fun styles of gameplay. Well, for the most part, there's one that's not very good, but the other 5 are phenomenal. And not to mention the amazing visuals and astounding soundtrack. It's really no competition for me when I say that Sonic Adventure 1 is my personal favourite game on the Sega Dreamcast. So, with that, I'm going to say thank you all for watching this video. I hope it was interesting and enjoyable for you. With this being the last video in September, this will be the last video on the Dreamcast for a while now. Unless you guys want me to continue to discuss it. I mean, if you want to see more videos on the Dreamcast, then I'd be more than happy to talk about it some more, but I think maybe people might be getting fed up with this now. So, I'd like to know if these videos discussing the Dreamcast have convinced any of you to actually go and buy a Dreamcast, or at least check out some of the games that were released on it. If so, you're welcome. But let me know what other kinds of videos you'd like to see, because I'm thinking of releasing one video a month where I talk about a specific console, like I do a retrospective of it, like I did for the Genesis 30th birthday and the Dreamcast 20th birthday. It wouldn't be necessarily linked to a birthday of a system, because I want to cover all systems that I own, like I said back in my first video. I'm going to do one of them a month, so a retrospective on a particular console that I own, unless there's high demand for one that I don't own, for whatever reason. And then, also each month, I'm going to make a why did this console succeed or fail story, like I did with the Dreamcast, and like I did with the Xbox 360. If the story is interesting enough, like there are some systems where the story isn't interesting, it's just like, oh, this was successful because they did everything right. That'd be a 2-minute video and it'd be over in, well, it'd be 2 minutes. But it wouldn't be very interesting. So there are a lot of console success and failure stories that are much more interesting than they might initially seem. So I'm going to be releasing one of those a month as well. But as for the other videos in the month, that's basically up to you guys. Any suggestions that are left on any of my videos will be considered and possibly turned into a video in the future. So, thank you all again for watching this video, and I'll see you all next week. Goodbye.